In Marietta, Georgia, when a lonely divorcee meets a handsome model, her way of life shifts from pain to pleasure.
My mom seemed to be head over heels for him.
But soon, money problems turn the hot and heavy romance into a sinister spree of terror.
She needed him desperately enough that she was willing to do whatever he asked of her.
They weren't gonna let us live.
And later, in Texas, Ashley Ervin is only 17 years old, but she's ready to take the world by storm.
She knew what she wanted in life and did everything she needed to do to achieve those goals.
Until young love has her driving towards a dark and dismal future.
She was on a path straight to disaster.
And she did it all for her man.
In Memphis, Tennessee, teenager Belinda Henry grows up in a loving family. She's happy and takes every opportunity to show it.
My mom was beautiful inside and out. She was very giving and caring. I remember her voice would be like so light and airy when she would sing.
Around the tender age of 21, Belinda marries her high school sweetheart. Early on, life is wonderful. But young love is hard to maintain. And 10 years in, things are less than perfect, and their turbulent relationship starts to affect their 2 children.
My mom and my dad was arguing about something. I can't remember what they were arguing about, but I know I was sitting in my room with the door closed listening.
They try to make it work, but it just isn't meant to be. And after another year, Belinda and her husband call it quits.
When couples get together when they're very young, too often what happens is, instead of growing together, these youngsters tend to just grow apart because they haven't really formed a sense of self.
But Belinda refuses to give up on love. A few years later, she meets a new man and once again ties the knot. She moves to Atlanta with her 2 kids and new hubby. But her second marriage is an even bigger disaster.
He did have a very bad attitude, and I think they probably clashed a lot because of that attitude.
And if that's not bad enough, Belinda suspects her husband is fooling around behind her back.
That was just like heartbreaking to her.
I just found a number in your jacket. Whose number is this?
To find out that she was being cheated on.
Her second marriage is over before she knows it, and it sends her into a downward spiral.
After that, that's probably when I realized that's when she was starting to get depressed, because that's when she was like, just stay in her room all day, and she just said she was just so sad and just depressed and tired.
After the breakup of her second relationship, Belinda was really distraught. And it really would have served her well emotionally, psychologically, if she had taken the time to heal by herself, without a man.
Now 38, she decides to make a fresh start 20 miles away in Marietta, Georgia.
I think change scenery was well needed after what had happened with her second husband.
And then one afternoon, it's her kids that convince Belinda to give love another chance.
We were in her room watching TV, and the chat line commercial came across the TV screen, and my brother was like,
Mom, you should call that number.
And we thought it was funny at the time, and that's how she met the next guy that she started dating.
The service hooks her up with 42-year-old Keith Henry, a former Marine and a current fashion model.
He did not look like a model. He looked like a regular, average, everyday man.
But Belinda immediately falls under his spell.
When Belinda got together with Keith, this was somewhat, for her, a healing kind of situation. She felt she wouldn't be abandoned.
The charmer also feels at ease enough to reveal his dark secrets.
He was a convicted felon. He had a prior conviction for armed robbery. He did 5 years in the Georgia State Penitentiary.
I was aware that he had a criminal past, that he had a long rap sheet, and me and my brother were looking like, what? And I guess it was like his way of intimidating us and letting us know, don't mess with me, because this is what I've done to people.
Keith's been a free man for the past 2 years, and Belinda is not slowed down one bit by his shady past. In fact, she falls into the same trap as her first 2 marriages. And after only about 3 months, Keith proposes, and she says,
Yes!
That was a big shock that she had went and married him. I didn't even know they were even thinking about marriage.
But it's not long before the romance is replaced with chaos.
Belinda had 2 children that she was trying to take care of. And now that she was married,
Disrespectful kid.
now he's an additional burden on her as well.
The bills keep piling up.
Yes, I paid the bill.
No one is knocking down Keith's door with modeling jobs.
Keith was an ex-convict and not able to get work. Really emasculated him, and that was a recipe for disaster.
Belinda!
As panic sets in, he decides to turn back to doing what comes naturally.
I got a plan.
Stealing. Last time his bank robberies landed him behind bars. But now, Keith has a surefire remedy to cure their financial woes and keep him out of prison.
You have to trust me.
Keith felt that a check cashing store would be a good target. Check cashing stores commonly bring in a lot of cash, and they are not as secure as banks.
Look, I mean, I got experience at this.
And he wants his woman by his side.
Yes.
Belinda did not have a prior criminal history. She came from a good family, and it becomes a very bad and very negative influence on her.
Trust me, it will work.
He was able to manipulate her to do anything to help him.
Okay?
With Belinda on board with the scheme to rob a check cashing store, the illicit lovers get to work.
His plan was to go to the manager's home very early in the morning and force the managers to provide him the codes and the means to enter the safe.
Then they'll hit the store before it opens and clean the place out. After a few days casing a local shop, they identify the perfect victim, 48-year-old Sheila Dates.
Sheila was the manager of a check cashing store in Marietta. She lived in Jonesboro in a small apartment complex with her daughter.
With no man or dog to cause problems, she looks like an easy target. Bright and early the next day, they make their move. It's a morning Sheila will never forget.
I was actually abed and asleep, and my daughter Regina gets up. She came upstairs and told me that there were 2 FBI agents at the door that wanted to talk to me.
The couple had posed as FBI agents and bought cheap badges at a gun show.
I came downstairs and saw them with their badges, and I let them in.
The dangerous couple doesn't bother with pleasantries. As soon as the door shuts behind them, they pull their guns.
It was the most terrifying experience of my life.
To Henry's husband, Keith convinces her that the only way to claw themselves out of debt is armed robbery. Posing as FBI agents, they barge into the house of check cashing store manager Sheila Dates and her 21-year-old daughter Regina.
We were told to sit down on the couch, and if we cooperated, we would get out of this alive. If not, we both would go out in body bags.
They tie the women up and demand Sheila explain how to steal the cash at her work without alerting police.
I felt like there was nothing that I could do. I had to tell them exactly how to get into the store.
There's 3 doors you have to go through.
Using the codes for the alarm and for the safe.
0787.
But the process is more complicated than they could have ever imagined.
And more than 10 minutes before the door opens.
She tried to explain to Keith and Belinda Henry what they needed to do to get in the store, but they were not able to get it down just right. And that's when the plan changed.
Keith decides to change tactics.
You have to go first.
Sheila would have to accompany Belinda to the store. He was going to stay at the apartment with her daughter, and that if anything went wrong, he would kill her.
At that point, I was in complete cooperation mode to make sure that nothing happened to my daughter.
Sheila turns to look at Regina, unsure if she will ever see her again.
That last moment was, I love you, Mommy. It was, I love you, baby girl. We couldn't say it, but we was seeing it in each other's eyes.
Belinda forces Sheila into Regina's car, and the two begin the drive to the check cashing store 42 miles away in Marietta.
After we got in the car, she pulled the gun to let me know that she meant business and not to try anything. I knew that she was in control, and I had to do what she told me to do, or else I was going to die.
Belinda's life was spiraling out of control, and her only anchor to reality is the hold that she has on Sheila
30 minutes later, the women arrive at the store, and it's go time. They have to work quickly before the other employees arrive for their shift or the store opens and customers start to show up.
She was walking behind me, still with the gun pointed at me. We had to go through 3 doors to get to the safe.
Sheila conveniently leaves out a key detail in the store's security. A sensor keeps track of how many people are near the safe.
The system was set up so that the safe would not open if 2 people were present. What Sheila was hoping is that once they approached the safe together, this would alert the outside alarm source that something was amiss.
Come on. Hey, open it.
Sheila punches in the code. But just as she planned, the safe doesn't open. Belinda starts to get anxious.
She saw that the door was not open and I could not get into the safe.
I need to call the security company.
I convinced her that if I didn't call them to unlock the safe, she wouldn't be able to get the money.
You want to get in here? I need to call them.
Reluctantly, she allows her captive to call the security company, but warns her to keep it cool.
No tricks. No tricks.
I had already been warned not to talk in code, so I knew not to try to alert the security people.
Yes, that is the code I put in.
I called the security person, and the safe still didn't open.
It's still not working.
The sensors were picking up the presence of 2 people at the safe.
Yes.
An anxious Sheila is allowed to call the security company a second time. Now she is confident that they will follow protocol and know something is wrong. But instead, she gets the shock of her life.
I was hoping that they would ask me, is everything okay? And I could just say no. But they never did. They just opened it.
Belinda finally gets her hands on the cash.
She reached in, she put all of the bills in a bag, which totaled approximately $16,000.
She could have walked away the first time when the safe didn't open, or the second time, but Belinda knows that her man is counting on her, even though it goes against her humanity. But she's doing this for her man.
She was definitely under his power.
And back at Sheila's home, Keith is prepared to do whatever it takes not to go back to jail.
They weren't gonna let us live.
And later in Houston, Texas, Ashley Ervin learns about life the hard way through her first love.
Ashley had her whole life ahead of her until she started dating Keith Ron.
She fell in love, she fell hard, and she lost her way.
Belinda's ruse as FBI agents was surprisingly effective. But as it turns out, they owe a lot to luck.
Before this happened, my store was actually robbed. So I'm thinking someone is actually coming to my house to investigate the robbery that had already taken place at the store. And that's why I let them in.
In Marietta, Georgia, Belinda Henry and her husband Keith are robbing a check-cashing store for some vast money. While Belinda forces manager Sheila Dates to help her clean out the safe, Keith is back at Sheila's house holding her 21-year-old daughter, Regina, hostage.
It was quite clear that Sheila and her daughter Regina were pawns to this game that Keith and Belinda had put together.
Keith told Sheila, if you don't fully cooperate and we don't get this money, I'm going to kill Regina.
Please don't do it.
The last thing she said to me was, "Mommy, do what they tell you to do."
But Keith has other plans.
He never intended to allow Regina to live.
Keith coldly ignores the frightened young woman's whimpers as she fears for her life.
He tied a cord around her neck and choked and asphyxiated her.
Regina was only 21 years old. And what's so horrific was that Keith had all along intended to murder Regina, to murder Sheila, because he didn't want to leave behind any witnesses. He didn't want to go back to jail.
After Keith is certain that Regina is dead, he calmly heads out to meet up with his wife. Back at the check-cashing store, Belinda is now faced with holding up her end of the deal.
After Belinda got all of the money, I was thinking she was just going to tie me up and just leave me in the store and go.
But her man Keith gave her explicit instructions.
He had told her that she had to kill me.
Why are you doing this? You have the money.
His intention was to eliminate witnesses.
I couldn't even tell you a reason why my mom would even think to go along with something like that. Had it not been for him, I honestly believe that she would never done anything like that.
Belinda knew that she had risked her own clean record, that she wanted to do anything she could for Keith, even if it meant losing any semblance of civility. And she knew that this wasn't the person she really wanted to be.
But there's no turning back for Belinda. Not wanting to draw attention with gunfire, she grabs a much quieter weapon. She even has some final words for Sheila.
She apologized and said, "I'm sorry," but still she strangled me anyway.
But Sheila isn't about to give up.
As she's pulling the cord around my neck tighter and tighter, I'm fighting harder and harder. The more I struggled, the more she pulled. There was blood all around my nose, and I fought for dear life for me and for my daughter until I passed out. Everything went black after that.
Once Sheila is out, Belinda grabs the bag of cash and runs for the door. She flees and dumps Sheila's car behind a strip mall and meets up with Keith, who is waiting for her, just as they planned. He asks if she killed the witness like he instructed, but all Belinda can say is, "I don't know." Back at the check-cashing store, Sheila begins to stir.
My eyes can hardly see, but I'm alive. I dragged myself to the phone to call 911 for help.
They send help right away, but Sheila only has one thing on her mind.
I think they killed my daughter. That's all I could say.
Investigators rush to her home and find Regina's lifeless body. Sheila is rushed to the hospital and she begs to know what happened to her daughter.
No one would give me an answer. Finally, the detectives said, "I know you've gone through an ordeal, but the man that stayed at the house killed your daughter."
Oh, my baby. Oh, no, my baby.
I didn't want to believe it, but in my heart, I think I knew it was true, but it still was unreal.
Sheila gathers herself and gives the officers in minute detail anything she can remember about her captors.
That was my determination and motivation to make sure that they knew everything about these people so that they could catch them. I sat down with the sketch artist. I gave them a perfect description of the both of them.
The police now know what the perps look like, and they set out to find them. Meanwhile, Keith and Belinda are in the wind, 30 miles away.
They were staying at a local hotel, and if they watched the news, they would have heard that Sheila survived.
With a witness that could put them behind bars, Keith knows there's no turning back. He convinces Belinda to go on a crime spree. If they go down, they will go down in style.
In many ways, Belinda was being held captive by Keith. One thing she knew for sure was that she could not go back to the life that she once had.
Leaving her 2 kids behind, Keith and Belinda hightail it to Nashville and start to blow through the $16,000 in stolen cash. Keith is finally able to lavish his woman in the finer things in life.
They actually went shopping, and they bought jewelry and clothing, and they went out and ate.
But their once deep pockets are starting to run low. With nothing to lose and everything to gain, the deadly couple decide it's time to strike again.
Following the homicide and the robbery here in Georgia, they then rob a bank.
Belinda waits in the car, while Keith walks in, shows the teller a gun, and demands money.
Belinda knew what it was like to finally have that kind of money. So she was not in touch with reality, the reality of civility, the reality of humanity.
This time, Keith and Belinda get away with a cool $17,000 and splurge on a used Mercedes. The pair then make their way to Belinda's old stomping grounds in Memphis. But what the lovers don't know is that back in Georgia, investigators are hot on their trail. Thanks to Sheila's detailed descriptions, they have identified both Keith and Belinda Henry.
We were able to gather information on Keith, and that led us to their home in Marietta.
From there, police used cell phone towers to triangulate the couple's location.
Belinda was in communication with her friend in Chicago. These series of phone calls that Belinda made enabled the FBI to track them as they moved from Tennessee to New Jersey.
The next day, agents close in on them.
The FBI simply made a phone call into the room. Belinda answered the phone.
Hello.
And she was told, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're out here. We have the location surrounded. We want you to come out.
Visibly shaken, Belinda shares the news with Keith.
Who was that?
FBI.
What?
They're here. It's over.
They here?
FBI, come out!
Keith knows that their time has just run out. He opens the door and raises his hands in the air. And then, the FBI have just surrounded the room of fugitive couple Belinda and Keith Henry at a motel off Route 1 in Elizabeth, New Jersey, when a single shot rings out from inside the room.
Keith slammed the door shut, and he went to check on Belinda.
Horrified, he sees his wife lying in a pool of blood on the bathroom floor. One shot to the head. Belinda has taken her own life.
She had been on this deadly roller coaster ride with Keith, and she couldn't come to terms with what she had done. And so, in her mind, the only way out was killing herself.
The FBI heard this gunshot, and of course they didn't know what had transpired inside the room, so they directed Keith to come out.
Hands in the air, Keith is arrested without incident. FBI and local authorities rush in, but there is nothing they can do for Belinda. They take her distraught husband in for questioning, and he takes the entire blame for everything.
He confessed to the crime in its entirety. He confessed to his preparation for the crime. He confessed to the murder of Regina, and that he manipulated her.
My mom never would have done anything like that unless it was something just suggested by him. My mom had no criminal background, no tickets or anything. He preyed upon her and played my mom like a fiddle.
It appears that Keith showed some remorse. He most likely felt responsible for that, and perhaps felt that by confessing, this was the final gift that he could give her.
A few days later, Keith is extradited back to Georgia. He's charged with the murder of Regina Dates, impersonating an officer, and possession of a firearm as a convicted felon. But Keith has one startling request.
He said, tell the district attorney, I want the death penalty. I've never had that happen, ever, in any murder case I've ever investigated.
The state grants his wish. Keith Henry is found guilty on all charges and is sentenced to death. With Keith safely behind bars, Sheila Dates begins to pick up the pieces.
I had to forgive them. It helped me heal. My best friend's now gone. She may not be here physically, but in my heart and in my spirit, she lives on.
Belinda Henry lost her life in the hopes of building a better one, all in the name of love. A few states away in Houston, Texas, 16-year-old Ashley Ervin's once promising future comes to a screeching halt when she shifts her focus from books to a boy. Childhood starts out rocky for Ashley in Houston's inner city. Looking for a better life, her mother packs up the family.
Ashley was raised in a single-family home. Her father was not too much in her life.
She lived in the projects for a little while, and then her mom moved her to a neighborhood in North Houston.
Basically, I was the mother and the father.
And she refuses to let any disadvantage slow her down.
Ashley was a very ambitious young lady. She knew what she wanted in life, and she did everything she needed to do to achieve those goals.
She told me what she was going to be before she knew what it was. She told me, Mom, I'll be a baby doctor. I said, a baby doctor? All right.
While many little girls forget their youthful dreams, Ashley holds on to hers. At Forest Brook High School, she is handpicked for their Accelerated Health Science Technology program.
Her path was clear. She volunteered for cancer walks. She volunteered with blood drives. She was a peer counselor. She was an honor roll student. She was very, very busy.
The determined high schooler packs her schedule even tighter when she gets her first job at a popular fast food restaurant. Pretty soon, her proud mother presents her with yet another first.
I popped up for school on her birthday, and I gave her some keys. I said, well, you know this car is for school and work on it. She said, that's all I need, Mom, because I'm going to college next year.
And the streak of firsts continues when her eye catches a handsome young man, 16-year-old Keithron Fields, Ashley's first love.
She met Keithron at a park one day, and then school started the following fall, and he went to school with her.
And like his new girlfriend, Keithron's family has recently relocated from the inner city. Things between the teenagers move fast.
They got closer in school, and they actually started saying that they were a couple at sophomore year.
But even with a new girlfriend at a new high school, Keithron struggles to leave his old friends behind.
Keithron and Ashley were very different. Keithron's crew was made up of kids who no one would be surprised, frankly, if they got into trouble.
This appears to have been a case of the good girl meets the bad boy. And even though in the movies we see that the opposites attract and the relationship works out, the reality is these sorts of situations rarely work out.
And it's her blind attraction to this street-hard teenager that will lead Ashley in a deadly direction.
It was young love, and that makes it the dangerous kind of love.
She was on a path straight to disaster.
In Houston, Texas, 16-year-old Ashley Ervin has an active life as a thriving high school student. But that all falls to the wayside after she begins dating tough guy Keithron Fields.
She was very driven and focused, but when she met Keithron, she shifted her focus and he became her main priority.
If you see Ashley, 2 seconds later, here comes Keithron. If you saw Keithron, 2 seconds later, here comes Ashley.
For their first 8 months together, the lovebirds go for long car rides, watch movies, or just hang out and chill. For a while, Ashley is the young man's whole world. But the honeymoon comes to a screeching halt when in rolls a third wheel from the old hood.
Keithron loves Ashley, but his heart is still with his crew,
Play, baby, come on now.
namely Dexter Johnson.
Dexter was the leader of the crew. He was a dominant type. He was volatile also. Ashley and Dexter actually knew each other as children.
But Dexter isn't the same kid she used to play hide and seek with. And she isn't crazy about sharing her new man with his old friend.
Ashley saw Dexter as perhaps an unfortunate part of the package.
Ashley put up with Dexter being around her and Keithron because she really needed to have that connection. Being so young and so now dependent on Keithron, she was willing to put up with any kind of arrangement.
Desperate to be with her man, Ashley, now 17, joins the boys one night as they cruise the streets.
Ashley has the car, so it's natural that they would want her to ride along.
The trio drives around for hours. Bored and exhausted, she finally agrees to let Dexter take the wheel.
She got in the back seat because she was tired and she fell asleep. She woke up when she heard the car door slam and Keithron say that woman didn't have any money.
It's clear the boys have been up to no good. From the sound of it, they've been robbing people. As far as she can tell, so far they've come up empty.
After this apparent failed robbery attempt of a woman at a bus stop who said she had no money, no jewelry, Dexter was pretty frustrated. He told Ashley, just drive them back to Keithron's house. Ashley started the drive home. All of a sudden, the boys told her, pull over. They see a man at a car wash.
The apprehensive teen does as she's told.
Dexter and Keithron immediately jump out with their guns. Dexter was not about to go home empty-handed. He saw this man as an easy target. It was dark, he was alone, and a few minutes later, Ashley heard one gunshot.
The boys yell for Ashley to pick them up. They hop in, and the teenagers speed off. Dexter vents his frustrations, feeling punked by the man who claimed he had no cash.
Ashley was curious about what just happened, and Dexter said, I had to do it.
Shocked by his callous admission, she makes the drive back in stunned silence.
Ashley realizes how dangerous this combination of Dexter and Keithron is, and that maybe her life is in jeopardy if she says something. She knows she's the getaway driver, so there is no turning back.
Back at Keithron's house, they immediately turn on the TV.
Dexter was particularly interested in watching the news to see if there were any living witnesses left.
They learned from watching the news that the man was 61-year-old Brady Davis. He was a retired school teacher from Forest Brook, the same high school where Ashley and Keithron attended.
And it turns out that the guy who they shot died.
In the weeks that follow, Ashley and Keithron keep to themselves. When they finally reunite with Dexter, Ashley doesn't dare bring up the shooting.
But before she knew it, she was back running the street with the guys.
Dexter told Keithron and Ashley that he was tired of petty crimes that didn't yield much money. He said he wanted to steal a car and then sell it. And he needed Keithron's help, and he needed Ashley's help.
I think she was put in a situation where if she walked away, they would come after her, or people she loved to care about.
Without wasting any time, the two musketeers, with Ashley as the reluctant third, begin prowling the streets. It's not long before they spot the perfect ride.
They finally saw a couple sitting in a car in front of a house. The young woman was named Maria. They were parked in front of her boyfriend's house. His name was Huey.
Dexter saw this as an opportunity. Not only could he steal a car, he could also rob the couple of their money.
Dexter and Keithron got out of the car. They ran up to the couple's car and started banging on the windows, showing them their weapons and demanding that the couple get out of the car.
At first, Maria refuses, but she sees the danger in their eyes and timidly opens the door.
He forced her out of that car and dragged her out by her hair.
Keithron and Dexter ordered Maria and Huey into the back seat.
The boys tell Ashley to follow them. After a 30-minute drive, they all arrive at a dark, deserted area close to a park.
Once they got to that wooded area, Dexter and Keithron demanded that Maria and Huey get out of the back seat. They demanded their wallets. They demanded their ATM PIN numbers. The couple gave them everything they asked for.
But for Dexter, it's still not enough.
Dexter hit Huey in the head with his gun and told Huey to get on the ground and take off his shirt.
Taking clothes off.
They ordered Maria to get completely naked, and Dexter told Maria to get into the back seat of the car.
Get in the car.
Ashley, frozen with fear, watches in terror as Dexter starts to undo his belt.
Things got completely out of hand.
Ashley was in way over her head.
Ashley Ervin always wanted to be a pediatrician. And it may have been because she was one of 3 siblings and pitched in whenever she was needed.
Ashley was my backbone. She was the help. She kept the little brothers and sisters in line. Her nickname is Mom.
Houston teen Ashley Ervin finds herself right in the middle of a terrifying scene. All thanks to her boyfriend, Keith Ron Fields,
What do you want? Shut up!
and his boy, Dexter Johnson.
Open up the purse.
Ashley had just seen her boyfriend, the guy she loves, take a young couple hostage. She couldn't believe her eyes. She couldn't believe she was a part of this.
And the night is only going to get worse.
Start taking them clothes off.
She saw Dexter unbuckling his belt, and she knew what she was about to witness was a rape.
Get in the car.
She is both heartbroken and disgusted to see Keith Ron chiming in on the heinous act.
Keith Ron was actually taunting Huey, telling Huey to watch as his brother Dexter raped his girlfriend.
After Dexter raped Maria,
Come on, let's go. Get your girl.
apparently she wasn't even able to stand and walk. She was so devastated, so distraught.
Ashley perhaps didn't tell them to stop, didn't go to the police, because she knew if she said something, it could cost her her own life.
Keep going.
Dexter and Keith Ron still aren't finished.
Within moments, Ashley hears gunshots.
Dexter and Keith Ron walk back from the woods, and Huey and Maria aren't with them. Dexter tells Ashley that they have to get out of there.
Dexter and Keith Ron got in the stolen car, with Ashley following. The 3 of them all went to a gas station where Dexter used Maria's stolen ATM and put gas in both cars.
They head home, and Ashley is deeply burdened by yet another secret.
It was bad enough that Ashley was involved in that first murder, but now she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She really loves Keith Ron, but she also knows what she's doing is wrong. She is in limbo.
Over the next few days, the once promising high school junior's life comes crashing down.
Dexter was arrested on an unrelated drug and weapons charge.
While he's being questioned, the cops have an extraordinary stroke of luck.
Maria's dad called the police and reported her missing.
Maria's father informs police that there are several charges on her credit card. When they check the surveillance footage at a gas station, police see Dexter using her credit card. Investigators already have their prime suspect sitting in interrogation. When they press him, the young gangster quickly cracks.
Dexter admitted to raping Maria and walking them into the woods, but he denies shooting them.
I ain't killed nobody.
Dexter was very quick to turn on his friends.
You need to talk to Keith Ron and Ashley, not me.
He tried to pin all the crimes on Keith Ron. He tried anything to save his own skin.
A few hours later, detectives locate Ashley at work and bring her in for her side of the story.
When police questioned Ashley, she was terrified. This is a girl who had never been in trouble with the law.
At first, Ashley didn't want to answer too many questions because she didn't want to implicate Keith Ron.
But pretty soon, the frightened teenager starts to talk. She gives police every last detail of what went down. Later that night, Keith Ron also lays it out on the line, and their stories match.
Both Ashley and Keith Ron made it clear to the authorities that it was Dexter who had committed the murders.
All 3 teenagers are convicted of capital murder. Dexter Johnson receives the death penalty.
Ashley and Keith Ron both received life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Ashley may have only acted as the getaway driver, but she will pay heavily for her involvement.
Ask my daughter why. What happened? Why you didn't tell me something? I could have helped you. I found out later why She would never tell me what happened because she was feared for my life.
It appears that Ashley stayed in the relationship because
The humid, heavy night air of Miami in 1991 didn't just hang over the streets. It suffocated them, carrying the scent of salt, gasoline, and a secret that would remain buried for over 3 decades. A secret that began with a single, brutal act of violence in an Art Deco apartment that should have been a sanctuary but became a scene of absolute, chilling termination. The victim, a rising star in the local fashion world, was found with nothing but a hauntingly precise mark on her wrist, a signature of sorts that the lead investigator, Detective Marcus Thorne, would spend the rest of his life obsessing over, never knowing that the shadows he was hunting were cast by someone sitting at his own family dinner table. It was a cold case that defied the logic of the time, a disappearance that turned into a homicide investigation which then collapsed into a vacuum of dead ends, broken leads, and the kind of institutional silence that eats away at the soul of a city. For 35 years, that silence held firm, a wall of glass between the truth and the living, until a breakthrough in familial DNA sequencing turned the scientific community's greatest achievement into the ultimate, personal nightmare for one of the city's most respected law enforcement figures. The crime scene was a masterpiece of forensic confusion, meticulously scrubbed of traditional markers, yet screaming with the frantic energy of a struggle that had gone completely unheard by the neighbors in the adjacent, neon-drenched units. Detective Thorne had walked that floor 1,000 times in his mind, reconstructing the movements of the intruder, the trajectory of the struggle, and the precise moment when the light of a young life was extinguished, never once considering that the phantom he was pursuing shared his own bloodline. The investigation had been characterized by a series of strange, inexplicable anomalies, the absence of forced entry, the strangely methodical placement of personal belongings, and the disappearance of a single, cryptic photograph from the victim's mantle, details that Thorne had filed away under unsolved mysteries. While the true architect of the crime moved through the city with the calculated ease of a man who knew exactly how the police worked. It was a ghost story written in the syntax of a homicide report, a narrative that had chilled the local precinct to the bone and sent a message that even the most well-guarded levs in Miami were vulnerable to the reach of the unknown. As the years ground on, the investigation into the 1991 tragedy shifted from an active pursuit to a festering wound in the side of the Miami Police Department, a case that detectives passed down like a cursed heirloom to the next generation. New technology arrived in waves: ballistics imaging, digital database cross-referencing, atmospheric residue analysis. But every time the team felt they were closing the gap, they found themselves staring at a void that refused to be filled, a testament to the killer's ability to remain invisible in a city that was rapidly changing around him. Thorne, meanwhile, climbed the ranks, his dedication to the Miami Art Deco murder becoming his defining professional trait, a tragic irony that made the final revelation all the more devastatingly cinematic in its scope. He had built his reputation on the promise of bringing the killer to justice, blind to the fact that his own domestic life was the very sanctuary that allowed the killer to refine his patterns, to study the police response, and to stay perpetually one step ahead of the law. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived in the spring of 2026, did not come from a confession or a sudden lapse in judgment, but from the relentless, uncaring perfection of modern genetic genealogy. A small, overlooked fiber from the victim's clothing, a thread that had been misidentified in 1991 as a generic synthetic blend, was subjected to a new, ultra-sensitive sequencing process that revealed traces of a rare, hereditary protein mutation found in less than 0.001% of the population. The match wasn't just a signal, it was a beacon, leading investigators not to a criminal database of known offenders, but to a private, family tree mapping service that had been quietly compiled over the last decade. The data pointed directly to an individual who had been living under the radar, a man whose existence had been so seamlessly integrated into the periphery of Thorne's own life that his DNA was already in the police family repository as an exemplary relative of a veteran detective, a cruel quirk of fate that had served as the perfect, unintended camouflage for 35 years. The realization that the killer was Julian Thorne, Marcus's younger, estranged brother, hit the precinct with the force of a tectonic shift, dismantling the established order of the department overnight and turning a celebrated cold case into the most explosive internal investigation in the history of the South. The detectives tasked with verifying the match worked in secret, terrified of the potential for a leak that would destroy the credibility of the entire department and, more importantly, shatter the man who had been the face of the investigation for 3 decades. They examined Julian's movements in 1991, reconstructing a life of quiet resentment and covert violence that had been hidden behind the persona of a struggling, introverted graphic designer, a man who had watched his brother achieve the status he craved and had struck out in a way that would, he hoped, create a mystery his brother could never solve. It was a dark, psychological warfare played out on a personal and public stage, a crime born of envy so profound it had mutated into a serial appetite for destruction. When the arrest team finally converged on Julian's quiet, coastal home in the early hours of the morning, they found a man who appeared to be waiting for them, surrounded by a makeshift shrine of clippings, police reports, and copies of the very evidence files that Marcus had compiled over the years. Julian didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply looked at the handcuffs with a chilling sense of completion, as if the long game he had been playing against his own brother had finally reached its necessary conclusion. The arrest was silent, professional, and utterly shattering, a tactical success that carried with it the collateral damage of destroying one of the most respected law enforcement families in Miami. News of the capture didn't just break the seal on the cold case, it ripped the fabric of the community's trust, forcing every citizen to confront the reality that the greatest monster in the city's recent history had been hiding in the shadow of the law itself. The interrogation was a study in psychological dissonance, with the detectives tasked with the questioning having to navigate the presence of a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a part of their own brotherhood, his DNA intertwined with the man who had been their captain, their mentor, and their friend. Julian spoke with a detached, clinical precision, describing the events of that night in 1991 as if they were a script he had memorized through endless repetition, detailing the way he had stalked the victim, the way he had watched his brother's initial investigation from the sidelines, and the way he had lived his entire life in the quiet, desperate hope that his brother would never catch him. It was a confession that didn't just solve the murder. It exposed the deep-seated, toxic resentments that had been brewing within the Thorne household, painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his entire existence to the destruction of his brother's legacy. As the evidence was laid out in the pretrial hearings, the sheer scale of Julian's deception became clear. He had not only killed in 1991, but he had actively influenced the course of Marcus's investigations, leaving anonymous tips that he knew would lead to dead ends, deliberately leaking information to the press to sow discord, and even attending the victim's memorial service to watch his brother's heartbreak firsthand. The courtroom, packed with journalists, legal scholars, and the lingering ghosts of the 1991 crime wave, was silent as the prosecution detailed the depth of the betrayal, a narrative of sibling rivalry turned into the stuff of nightmares. Marcus Thorne, sitting in the front row, became the visual anchor of the drama, a man who was simultaneously the investigator, the victim, and the brother, his face a mask of absolute, frozen horror as he listened to his sibling recount the details of a murder that had consumed his entire adult life. The trial itself was a whirlwind of forensic testimony, public outrage, and media obsession, with the Thorne brother murder becoming the defining case of the decade, a story that crossed state lines and penetrated every layer of the justice system. Experts from across the country were brought in to analyze the psyche of the killer, to discuss the implications of familial DNA, and to debate the systemic failures that had allowed a serial offender to remain undetected for so long in an environment of constant surveillance. It was a trial that transcended the specifics of the 1991 crime. It was a trial about the nature of truth in an age of technology, about the limits of institutional knowledge, and about the devastating, inescapable reality that the worst things in life often come from the places we feel safest. As the verdict of guilty was handed down, the city of Miami didn't celebrate. It exhaled, a collective release of tension that had been building for 35 years, but the shadow cast by the revelation remained, a permanent stain on the history of the police department and the family that had served it. The case of the 1991 murder was solved, the files were archived, and the killer was behind bars for the rest of his life. But the questions it raised about the ethics of internal investigations, the dangers of nepotism in law enforcement, and the terrifying, unpredictable nature of human envy remained, hanging in the humid air like a permanent storm front. The case was a victory for science, a triumph for the persistence of the truth, but it was also a warning, a reminder that in the hunt for the killer, the greatest danger is often the one you are too blinded by love or duty to see. The final, lasting impact of the case was the fundamental shift in how the Miami Police Department, and indeed the entire nation, approached the use of familial DNA in cold cases, creating a new, rigorous protocol that prioritized the integrity of the truth over the comforts of internal loyalty. The story of the Thorne brothers would eventually become a lesson, a cautionary tale taught to the next generation of law enforcement, but in the immediate aftermath, it stood as a monument to the endurance of the secret, the power of technology, and the terrible, beautiful, and devastating nature of the truth. The 1991 cold case was closed, the ghost of the victim was finally at peace, and the city of Miami moved forward, permanently changed, forever haunted by the memory of the detective who hunted for years, only to realize he had been looking at the monster in the mirror. The aftermath of the verdict was not a sudden explosion of triumph, but a slow, suffocating realization of the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. As the media circus surrounding the Thorne brothers began to lose its frantic, breaking news intensity, the city of Miami was left to grapple with the structural rot the trial had exposed. Detective Marcus Thorne, the man who had been the face of the investigation for over 3 decades, had vanished from public life, his absence becoming a loud, echoing testament to the destruction of his professional and personal identity. The police department, once a symbol of stability and rigorous enforcement, found itself in the throes of a deep, existential crisis. The Thorne Protocol, the internal investigation launched to understand how an active-duty investigator could be systematically manipulated and undermined by his own sibling, became the focal point of a massive, statewide audit of internal affairs. It was a process of painful, surgical transparency, where every file, every interaction, and every closed case associated with Marcus was pulled from the archives to be scrutinized for potential subconscious interference. The forensic laboratory, initially the engine of the investigation's success, transitioned into a place of grim, institutional reflection. The same scientists who had celebrated the breakthrough of the protein mutation now found themselves in the role of historians, painstakingly reviewing the thousands of hours of evidence processing that had occurred during Marcus's tenure. They uncovered a harrowing pattern. Julian Thorne had not just lived in the periphery of Marcus's life. He had actively curated his brother's professional failures. Every time Marcus came close to a lead, Julian had been there to nudge the investigation in a different direction. Anonymous calls to the tips line, the strategic planting of misleading evidence in the field, and the subtle, expert manipulation of forensic samples that would eventually lead to the exoneration of low-level suspects. The discovery was a chilling revelation of how a serial killer had essentially turned the power of the state's investigative machinery against itself, using his brother's ambition as the very tool to ensure his own survival. As the detectives of the new task force delved deeper into the 1991 crime wave, they began to realize the scope of the deception went far beyond the single, initial murder. Julian hadn't just stopped at one. He had become a connoisseur of the undetected, a man who saw the city of Miami as a vast, unprotected playground. The investigators identified 3 other cold cases from the early 90s, murders that had been dismissed as accidents or drug-related violence, that shared the same, unique forensic signature. The realization that they had been hunting a serial predator who had claimed multiple victims while the city was gripped by the panic of the era sent a surge of fresh horror through the community. The 1991 murder was no longer an anomaly. It was the start of an era of hidden, systematic violence that had remained undisturbed in the shadows because the man in charge of the light was the killer's own flesh and blood. The personal impact on the victims' families was absolute and, for many, impossible to fully process. Those who had spent decades fighting for the truth, holding press conferences, and pleading with the department to prioritize their lost loved ones, now faced the reality that their struggle had been intentionally sabotaged from within. The meetings between the investigators and these families were harrowing, a series of painful admissions that replaced the long-term, agonizing uncertainty of the unsolved cases with the cold, hard weight of a betrayal that had been sanctioned by the very people sworn to protect them. The foundation that the families began to form was no longer just about raising awareness. It was about demanding accountability, a powerful, organized movement that forced the Miami police to acknowledge their institutional complicity. They were the ones who finally gave the forgotten victims a voice, ensuring that the legacy of the 1991 crime wave would not be defined by the killer's success, but by the family's relentless pursuit of the truth. In the suburban neighborhoods where Julian had lived, the air remained heavy with the residue of the revelation. Neighbors who had shared barbecues, exchanged pleasantries, and even borrowed tools from a man they knew as a quiet, introverted artist were forced to confront the reality that they had been living in the shadow of a monster. The community, once marked by a sense of neighborly warmth, became a place of suspicion and withdrawal. The houses themselves seemed to hold the weight of the secret, the silent, unassuming exteriors belying the depths of the depravity that had been practiced within. Discussions at the local coffee shops, in the quiet corners of the parks, and in the late-night sessions of family therapy turned to the nature of evil, the necessity of vigilance, and the terrifying, impossible task of rebuilding trust in a society that had proven to be deeply, fundamentally fractured. The investigative team, meanwhile, was working to compile the most comprehensive dossier on a serial killer in the history of the Florida justice system. They were not just documenting the murders, they were documenting the methodology of the deception. Every email, every text message, every bank statement, and every transcript of Julian's confession was being organized into a permanent, secure repository that would serve as the definitive account of the Thorne case. They wanted to ensure that the story of the 1991 cold case was not a mystery to be solved, but a lesson to be analyzed for generations of law enforcement officers to come. The case had become the ultimate cautionary tale, a document of necessity meant to ensure that the mistakes of the 90s, the reliance on individual heroism, the failure of internal checks, and the dangerous assumption that familial loyalty was a professional asset, would never again be repeated in the digital, data-driven age of 2026. As the second month of the post-trial era drew to a close, the focus of the task force shifted toward the permanent closure of the case files. They were preparing for the final, official briefing that would lay out the entire timeline of the serial disappearances, the methods of the killings, and the forensic evidence that had finally caught up to the man. It was a process of closure that was as much for the investigators as it was for the public. They had been living in the shadow of the 1991 case for years, a burden that had now been lifted, but a burden that had left a mark on their own professional and personal identities. They had finally done what they had been trained to do, but the cost was a deeper, more sobering understanding of the nature of the work they performed and the limits of the justice they provided. The city of Miami, ever the resilient, complex urban machine, was beginning to move past the immediate trauma of the revelation, even as the details continued to seep into the public consciousness. The park where the initial memorial had been held was still a space of quiet, reflective presence. People would walk by, leave a flower, and keep moving, a testament to the city's ability to hold onto the memory without being defined by the tragedy. The investigation was essentially over, but the work of integrating the truth into the city's identity was only just beginning. The Miami of 2026, forged in the fires of this revelation, was a place that was less idealistic, perhaps, but more grounded, more vigilant, and more fundamentally aware of the reality that existed beneath the surface of the things we trust the most. In the final, quiet days of the aftermath, the lead detective on the case sat in his office, looking at the folders that now contained the totality of Julian Thorne's existence. He had spent his career looking for this man, and now that the search was over, he felt a strange, hollow sense of satisfaction. The case was closed, the monster was gone, and the truth had been brought to light. He was left with the weight of the work, the memory of the victims, and the knowledge that the world he was returning to was not a safer place, but a more honest one. The reality of 1991 had been confronted, the secret was fully unearthed, and the city, having walked through the long, dark tunnel of this investigation, was finally and fully ready to face the complexities of its own, enduring and often hidden history. The legacy of the Shadow Hunter was slowly being stripped of its mystery, replaced by the mundane, horrific reality of a predator who had simply been very, very good at hiding. The investigators were finding that the Thorn Killer wasn't a supernatural figure, but a profoundly ordinary man who had made a conscious, daily decision to indulge the darkness within him. He was a man who had chosen to be a killer and then had chosen to be an artist, and had managed to balance the two with a chilling, sociopathic ease. This realization was, in some ways, more terrifying than any idea of a criminal mastermind. It forced the community to confront the fact that evil is not always a force that comes from the outside. Sometimes, it is the person sitting in the front row, the person who smiles at you across the fence, the person who shares your blood. The city of Miami would eventually and inevitably return to its normal, pulsating rhythm, but it would do so with a permanent, subtle tremor in its foundations. The story of the Thorn brothers would be a permanent addition to the folklore of the city, a tale told in hushed tones whenever the topic of the 1991 era came up. The ghost of the killer was gone, and the silence that remained was the silence of a city that had finally, at long last, got it right. The truth, in its brutal, unsparing, and definitive clarity, was the only thing that had been able to wash the streets of Miami clean, and in that, the city finally found its long-sought and hard-earned resolution. The courtroom, where the final act of the Thorn brothers' tragedy unfolded, was not a place of catharsis, but a sterile chamber of unrelenting, clinical dissection. As the trial entered its third week, the prosecution shifted focus from the emotional weight of the crimes to the technical, mechanical reality of the deception, the way Julian Thorn had weaponized his brother's professional life to create a state of permanent impunity. The evidence presented was staggering in its level of detail. Thousands of digital footprints, carefully archived by Julian, proving that he had been tracking Marcus's investigations in real time, often anticipating the next move of the department before the detectives themselves had even finalized their strategy. The jury, a diverse cross-section of Miami's citizenry, sat in a state of growing, visceral disbelief as they realized that they were witnessing the internal architecture of a predator who had treated the entire justice system as his own private game. The digital forensic expert's testimony proved to be the pivotal moment. He demonstrated, through a series of complex data visualizations, how Julian had used a series of decentralized, untraceable servers to intercept police communications and feed false leads into the precinct's tip line. Each slide projected onto the courtroom wall showed a pattern of interference that was both brilliant and chillingly precise. Julian hadn't been avoiding the police. He had been the police. He had known the patrol routes, the shift schedules, and the specific investigative habits of his brother with an intimacy that allowed him to commit his crimes in the very shadows Marcus was illuminating. The realization that the murderer had been, in essence, the silent, invisible partner of the lead detective turned the courtroom into a place of heavy, suffocating silence. It was no longer a trial about a series of murders. It was a trial about the fundamental, structural betrayal of the oath of office. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a portrait of Julian Thorn that was utterly, unnervingly normal. Colleagues from his graphic design firm described a man who was quiet, collaborative, and deeply obsessed with the concept of perception, how easily the human eye could be fooled, how quickly a narrative could be rewritten by a single, carefully placed detail. These observations, when placed alongside the reality of his double life, suggested a man who had viewed his existence as a performance art piece, a grand, dark experiment to see how far he could push the boundaries of his brother's trust. One colleague recalled a conversation where Julian had mused about the idea of the perfect crime being one where the investigator is the one who ultimately builds the case for your own innocence. It was a throwaway comment that, in the context of the trial, felt like a confession of his deepest, darkest intent. The defense, faced with a mountain of evidence that made a narrative of innocence impossible, attempted to pivot toward a psychiatric defense rooted in the concept of obsessive-compulsive pathology. They argued that Julian's actions were not the result of premeditated, sociopathic intent, but of a deeply ingrained, uncontrollable compulsion to recreate the perfect scenario of his brother's life, that his crimes were a tragic, twisted manifestation of a sibling's need to be seen, to be heard, and to prove that he was, in some fundamental way, his brother's superior. It was a sophisticated, high-stakes gambit, but it ultimately crumbled under the weight of the physical evidence. The prosecution produced the trophy box found in Julian's coastal home, a collection of items taken from his victims, each one meticulously preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag, accompanied by notes written in the same, precise handwriting that he used for his professional designs. The atmosphere in the courtroom reached a fever pitch when the prosecution read these notes into the record. They were not the ramblings of a man driven by compulsion. They were the cold, detached observations of a man who viewed his victims as objects of study. Subject showed minimal resistance. One note read, dated to 1991. The investigation is moving slowly. Marcus is frustrated. It is fascinating to watch. The words were read in a flat, monotone voice by the prosecutor, but they hit the room like physical blows. The jury, which had shown moments of hesitation, suddenly became a collective of hardened, resolve-filled individuals. The psychiatric defense was revealed to be exactly what it was, a fabrication, an attempt to rationalize the irrational, a way to cloak a predator in the dignity of a mental illness. The task force's deep dive into the Miami geography of the 1991 crimes revealed that Julian had been, in some ways, a creature of habit. He hadn't just hunted in the dark, he had hunted in the paths of his brother's duty. He knew where Marcus was going to be, he knew what the crime scene would look like, and he knew how to leave behind just enough forensic evidence to keep the investigation focused on his own personal leads. This discovery fundamentally altered the way the detectives viewed the entire case. The killer hadn't been an elusive ghost moving through the dark. He had been a companion, a shadow, a presence that had been with them from the very start. It was a realization that fundamentally changed the way the Miami Police Department viewed their own internal security, a shift that would lead to a total, and often contentious, overhaul of the department's protocols for dealing with internal conflicts of interest. The final element of the prosecution's case was the presentation of the physical evidence recovered from the secret storage units, which had been traced to Julian's estate through his financial records. These items, jewelry, personal effects, and remnants of clothing, were the physical manifest of the shadow hunter. As they were displayed, one by one, for the jury to see, the silence in the courtroom became absolute. These were not just items, they were the final, lingering connections to the lives that had been stolen. The families of the victims, who had been sitting in the back of the room for every grueling hour of the trial, finally allowed themselves to show emotion. The weeping, which had been suppressed for decades, finally broke free, a sound that seemed to be the only thing filling the chamber. Julian, sitting in the dock, remained utterly, terrifyingly still, his face a mask of complete, impenetrable indifference. As the trial entered its final week, the city of Miami was a crucible of anticipation. The news media had ceased to focus on the individual victims and were now focused on the total, systemic collapse of the image of the Thorne brothers. The questions being asked were no longer, how did he kill? But why did we let him? The investigation into the department's recruitment and promotion practices had revealed a culture of fraternal bias that was as complicit as the killer himself. The command staff, the internal affairs investigators, the union leaders, all were now being subjected to the same level of forensic scrutiny that had once been reserved for the criminal underworld. The city was undergoing a period of radical, uncomfortable transparency, a scrubbing of the soul that was essential if the community was to survive the betrayal. The defense attorney, in his final closing statement, tried to sound a note of mercy, urging the jury to remember that the man sitting at the table was not the monster of the headlines, but a human being who had been broken by the shadow of his own brother's success. It was a bizarre, morally bankrupt argument that seemed to alienate even his own, hand-picked defense team. The prosecution, in turn, delivered a closing that was a masterpiece of moral clarity. They didn't focus on the monster. They focused on the victims, reading their names one by one, describing the lives they had led, the people they had loved, and the futures they had been denied. They didn't ask for anger. They asked for justice, the kind of justice that acknowledges that the value of a life is not mitigated by the time it was lost, or the mask worn by the one who took it. The jury returned from deliberations in record time. The atmosphere in the courtroom was not one of excitement, but of a heavy, suffocating duty. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, with no consideration for the psychiatric mitigation, the room didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no shouting, only a quiet, shaking release of tension. The families of the victims, sitting in the front rows, finally allowed themselves to weep, a sound that seemed to be the only thing filling the chamber. Marcus Thorne, who had been sitting in the courtroom since the start of the trial, simply stood up, turned away, and walked out of the room, his departure as silent and as final as the conclusion of the case itself. The sentencing hearing was a brief, procedural affair. Julian, stripped of his composure, stood before the judge. He looked small, insignificant, and utterly devoid of the power he had once wielded over the city and his own family. He didn't offer a final statement, and the judge, in turn, didn't offer a final lecture. The sentence was a life without the possibility of parole, a term that would be served in a maximum security facility, isolated from the public and the community he had so effectively manipulated. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom, the man who had been the architect of a decades-long nightmare was suddenly gone, a non-entity in the history of the Commonwealth of Florida. The trial was over, but the work of the city was just beginning. The archives of the case were sent to the permanent state repository, where they would be the foundation for a new era of cold case investigation in the state. The investigators, now recognized as the architects of a modern forensic revolution, were receiving international recognition for their work. They were moving on to other cases, other mysteries, other shadows, but the case of the Thorne brothers would always be the defining moment of their careers. They had walked through the dark, and they had come out the other side with a clarity that the city had not possessed in 30 years. The case was closed, the monster was removed from the light, and the silence of the Miami streets was, finally, the silence of a city that had faced its own shadow and won. The legacy of the 1991 cold case would be the realization that no secret, no matter how deep the burial, could withstand the relentless, grinding progress of truth. The forensic scientists, the investigative task force, and the families who had never given up hope were the ultimate guardians of this idea. They had proven that justice, when applied with enough persistence, is not just a concept, but a mechanical, inescapable, and absolute reality. The ghost of 1991 was finally at rest, and the city, having walked through the long, agonizing tunnel of its own failures, had finally emerged into a future that was grounded in the honesty of its own, resilient, and enduring reality. The record was set straight, the debt of history was paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continued to move forward, not as a place of secrets, but as a place that had finally, at long last, achieved the clarity it had been chasing for so long, a clarity that would continue to define its moral character for generations to come. The verdict had been read, the gavel had fallen, and the man who had turned a city's justice system into his own personal puppet show was headed to a life behind concrete walls, yet the atmospheric pressure over Miami remained, if anything, even more suffocating. The aftermath of the Thorne trial was not a sudden release of tension but a slow, heavy descent into the reality of what the investigation had actually uncovered. It wasn't just a case of one man's depravity, it was a profound, institutional breakdown. The city of Miami, a place that thrived on the vibrant, neon-lit aesthetics of the late 20th century, found itself forced to look at the dark, structural rot that had been allowed to fester under the skin of its most protected institutions. The unmasking of Julian Thorne as the shadow hunter had fundamentally altered the social contract of the Florida coast, transforming trust from a foundational, assumed baseline into a volatile, fragile currency that now required rigorous, forensic verification before it could be spent. The lead detectives, now part of the newly formed Institutional Predation Unit, began the arduous process of auditing every department, division, and committee that Marcus Thorne had influenced during his 3-decade tenure. This was not a pursuit of other crimes, but a pursuit of the enabling mechanisms. They combed through 20 years of personnel files, donation records, and confidential informant logs, searching for the patterns of behavior that had been ignored, suppressed, or simply misunderstood as the eccentricities of a man who was, at the time, seen as the department's greatest asset. The findings were not always instances of outright conspiracy, but rather examples of a systemic, cultural bias, a collective, implicit belief that an individual's rank and reputation were sufficient safeguards against the possibility of corruption. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to conceive that the greatest danger might not be the outsider, but the one who holds the keys to the station. While the legal and institutional work continued, the human impact was manifesting in ways that were far less bureaucratic. The victims' families, now united by the weight of their shared history, began the process of establishing a permanent memorial, a space that would serve as both a site of remembrance and a public classroom for forensic ethics. They secured a plot of land near the site of the first 1991 abduction, a location that had been a derelict warehouse for decades but was being reimagined as a contemplative, public garden. The design was minimalist, prioritizing the quiet, natural environment over the spectacle of the event. It was intended to be a place of reflection, a site where the memory of the victims could finally be disentangled from the story of their killer. For these families, the victory was not the sentencing itself. It was the ability to take control of their own narrative, to transition from the position of the grieving to the position of the stewards of their own history. The Miami Police Department, meanwhile, was in the midst of its own painful, internal reconstruction. Forced to reckon with the reality that their most sacred sanctuary, the station house, had been the hunting ground of a sociopath who moved through it like a ghost, the leadership was in the midst of a profound and often bitter debate about its future. Many veteran officers retired, unable to reconcile their service with the truth of the Thorne era, while others stayed, determined to redefine the department not as a monument to its past, but as an active agent in the healing of the present. The process of purging the influence of the Thorne brothers was not just about removing their names from the plaques and the records. It was about fundamentally restructuring the department's recruitment, vetting, and internal reporting mechanisms. It was a slow, agonizing process of rebuilding, one that required the community to confront its own participation in the culture of silence that had allowed the shadow hunter to flourish for so long. The forensic laboratory, which had become the engine of the investigation, began to expand its focus to the wider, national implications of the Miami cold case. They realized that the shadow hunter wasn't just a local anomaly, but a case study in a broader phenomenon, the gentleman predator, the individual who uses the appearance of familial or professional virtue to maintain a lethal anonymity. They were being contacted by cold case units from across the country, each one sharing their own stories of figures who had managed to evade suspicion for decades while operating within the light of institutional protection. The team began to create a central repository of these investigative insights, a database designed to help other units recognize the patterns of the predator who hides in the light. They were becoming the intellectual leaders of a new movement in forensic history, a group dedicated to the idea that the passage of time is no longer an excuse for the impunity of the offender. As for the media coverage, the initial sensationalist shock had evolved into a more substantial, analytical dialogue. Major publications were launching long-form, investigative series that looked beyond the immediate facts of the Miami case and into the sociological question of how our society creates the environment for such individuals to thrive. They interviewed psychologists, urban planners, and sociologists, all trying to piece together the mosaic of Julian Thorne's environment. The conversation had shifted from, how could he do it, to what does this say about the way we organize our communities and our trust? It was a deeper, more necessary discussion, one that recognized that the shadow hunter was not a freak of nature, but a product of the structures he had learned to navigate so expertly. Behind the scenes, the investigative work continued to reveal the depth of Julian's preparation. The detectives discovered that he had been in communication with other individuals across the state, not fellow killers, but people in positions of power who had enabled his lifestyle, likely through a complex series of financial exchanges that were still being untangled. The case was expanding, revealing a network of influence that went beyond the immediate geography of Miami. It was a sobering realization. The shadow hunter hadn't been an isolated figure, but a man who had understood the mechanics of power and had successfully leveraged them to ensure his own survival. This was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a revelation that suggested the case of the shadow hunter was far from the simple, solved narrative it had first appeared to be. The investigation was now focused on tracking the financial traces of this wider network. The detectives, working with forensic accountants and federal investigators, were tracing the money, the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, and the untraceable contributions that had fueled Julian's life of suburban stability. They were uncovering a complex, global system of leverage, a web of interests that went far beyond the Florida coast. The task was monumental, a process of excavating the bedrock of an empire that had been built on the proceeds of crime and the protection of the corrupt. Every lead, every document, every signature was another piece of the puzzle, a slow, methodical effort to ensure that the shadow hunter's influence would be truly and finally dismantled. As the months stretched on, the detectives felt the weight of the investigation shifting. It was no longer just about the past, it was about the potential for future discoveries. The case of the Miami cold case had become the anchor for a much wider investigation into the nature of power and the mechanisms of its protection. The investigators were realizing that they weren't just solving a murder. They were exposing the fault lines of an entire society, the hidden pathways where wealth, influence, and criminality intersected. It was a heavy, exhilarating, and often frightening reality. They were working on a scale that exceeded anything they had ever imagined, a project that was no longer just about the law, but about the very foundations of the society they were sworn to protect. The city of Miami, meanwhile, was beginning to move forward in its own way. The memory of the shadow hunter was becoming integrated into the city's identity, a dark, necessary component of its history. People were more skeptical, more alert, and more willing to ask the questions that had been ignored in the past. The city was undergoing a period of civic renewal, a process of rebuilding trust, and a commitment to the hard, unglamorous work of local integrity. The case was the catalyst for a new, grounded, and increasingly self-aware civic life. The shadow hunter had taken so much, but he had also left behind a society that was now better prepared to deal with the shadows, a society that understood that the only way to protect the light was to be constantly and actively looking for the places where the dark could hide. In the final, contemplative evenings of this era, walking through the streets of the city, one could feel the profound change in the atmosphere. The expectations of leaders were higher, the civic consciousness more attuned to the reality beneath the surface. The city had learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be mastered. It was a mature, honest city, a city that had weathered the storm of its own dark history and had come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The resolution of the 1991 case had provided the framework, but the city's own collective resolve had built the reality. The ghost of the shadow hunter was gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, was finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. The investigators remained the guardians of this new era. They had seen the cost of silence, and they had committed themselves to the rigorous, exhaustive, and often thankless work of keeping the city's moral records clean. Every file in the archives, every entry in the database, every forensic report was now a testament to the belief that the truth is the most valuable resource a community can possess. They had walked through the dark, and they had come out the other side with a clarity that the city had not possessed in 30 years. The case was closed, the monster was removed from the light, and the silence of the Miami streets was, finally, the silence of a city that had faced its own shadow and won. The record was set straight, the debt of history was paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continued to move forward, not as a place of secrets, but as a place that was finally and definitively reclaiming its own future. The fallout from the Thorne investigation reached far beyond the boundaries of Miami, creating a ripple effect that forced a radical, national reevaluation of how police departments manage internal conflicts of interest. The Forensic Task Force, now operating with the full support of both state and federal authorities, had become the epicenter of a new movement in criminal justice, the forensic audit of institutional integrity. Their work revealed that Julian Thorne's ability to remain undetected was not merely a result of his own cunning, but a reflection of a systemic, cultural flaw that prioritized the reputation of the department over the pursuit of the truth. The realization that an entire homicide unit had been effectively neutralized by the presence of a single, well-placed predator was a devastating blow to the public's confidence in law enforcement. It forced the Miami Police Department to dismantle its existing hierarchy and replace it with a structure that emphasized total, external oversight, ensuring that no individual or family could ever again exert such unchecked influence over the course of a criminal investigation. The investigators, now working in a landscape of intense scrutiny and high stakes, began the process of documenting the full, horrific extent of Julian's operations during the 1991 period. They discovered that his crimes were not random outbursts of violence, but a calculated, orchestrated campaign of predation that utilized the very tools and resources of the police department he was manipulating. He had access to the crime scene logs before the first responders even arrived. He had the power to influence the assignment of evidence to specific, less experienced technicians, and he had the chillingly effective ability to frame the narrative of each murder in a way that pointed to external, unrelated suspects. This revelation transformed the case from a localized, personal tragedy into a national, systemic scandal, forcing the department to open its internal records to an independent, nonpartisan commission that would, for the first time in Florida's history, be granted total access to the police department's files. The congregants of the city's civic and police organizations, meanwhile, were struggling with the profound, daily reality of this revelation. The station house that had once been the symbol of the city's defense now felt like an alien, compromised space, a stage where a master manipulator had played his role to perfection. Many officers, unable to reconcile their service with the truth of the Thorne era, chose to resign, creating a vacuum that triggered a wider crisis of institutional stability and morale. The city leadership, desperate to prevent a total collapse, launched a series of reforms designed to restore the public's trust, but these efforts were initially met with deep, ingrained skepticism. It became clear that the institution had not been an innocent bystander, but an enabling structure that had provided Julian with the absolute, unearned trust of a system, the very trust he needed to make himself effectively invisible. The human cost of this investigation was becoming increasingly heavy for the detectives themselves. They were not just processing files. They were living within the mind of a man who had successfully mirrored their own professional lives. They were realizing that the shadow hunter had been watching them, too, analyzing their movements, predicting their reactions, and subtly guiding their work toward the same, dead-end conclusions he had crafted decades ago. The discovery that he had been in a perverse, one-sided game of cat-and-mouse with the very people trying to stop him added a layer of chilling, intimate terror to the entire case. It meant that the cold case was never actually cold. It was a living, breathing conflict that had been actively fueled by the pride, the sociopathy, and the cruelty of the killer himself. As the detectives finalized the last phase of their institutional audit, they began to prepare the final report on institutional vulnerabilities, a comprehensive analysis that would change the way law enforcement organizations were vetted and monitored in the state. This report, which would eventually be presented to the state legislature, argued that the traditional, hands-off approach to departmental independence was a fatal flaw in the civic oversight system. It recommended mandatory, independent financial and operational audits for any police department with significant public-facing responsibilities and a standardized vetting process for leadership that went far beyond the internal, opaque mechanisms of the police union itself. The report was a call to arms for a new era of civic protection, a demand that the safety of the public be prioritized over the traditional, outdated protections afforded to private, institutional power. The victims' families, watching the progress of the investigation from the sidelines, were finding their own path toward resolution. They were moving from a state of reactive grief to a position of proactive, influential advocacy. They were now the public face of the push for the new legislation, appearing at legislative hearings and town hall meetings to demand that the state take action. Their presence was a powerful, humanizing force, a reminder that the cold, legalistic language of the detectives' reports was rooted in the permanent, stolen potential of their loved ones. They were the ones who ensured that the story of the shadow hunter would not be reduced to a footnote in a criminal justice text, but would remain a vibrant, active, and essential warning for the future. The city of Miami itself was undergoing a quiet, profound change. The memory of the shadow hunter was being integrated into the city's civic identity, not as a source of shame, but as a catalyst for a more vigilant, skeptical, and ultimately more empowered population. The public was becoming more involved in the daily operations of their neighborhoods, more engaged with their local leadership, and more willing to demand transparency in the institutions that claimed to serve them. The case of the 1991 cold case had acted as a filter, clearing away the comfortable, aesthetic illusions of the late 20th century and replacing them with the hard, necessary realities of the 21st. It was a city that was less naive, but significantly more robust, its civic resilience forged in the fires of a betrayal that had hit closer to home than anyone had ever thought possible. The forensic laboratory was also enjoying a period of renewed purpose, having transitioned from a place of technical labor to a hub of global, forensic innovation. The techniques they had refined during the Thorne investigation were now being used to address issues that went far beyond the resolution of individual crimes. They were developing new ways of tracking systemic corruption, creating and maintaining the forensic records of institutional failure, and serving as the primary, objective center of truth in an era where information was often weaponized and unreliable. They had become the guardians of the record, the final, incorruptible source of evidence in a city that was finally and definitively reclaiming its own, honest identity. In the final, contemplative evenings of this era, the city of Miami moved with a renewed, steady motion. The streets, the skyline, the institutions, all seemed to vibrate with a new, sober awareness. The memory of Julian Thorne was now a closed chapter, a historical event that had been fully processed, acknowledged, and archived. The city had regained its voice, and it had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the only thing more dangerous than a man who thinks he can own the truth is a society that lets him believe it. The victims, now honored as the symbols of a city's resilience, were at peace. The record was set straight, the debt of history was paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continued to move forward, not as a place of shadows and secrets, but as a place that was grounded in the honesty of its own, resilient reality. Looking back, the entire Thorne saga was a testament to the idea that justice is not just a destination. It is a labor, a continuous, exhausting, and often dangerous struggle. The investigators, the prosecutors, the witnesses, and the jurors who had participated in the trial had all given a piece of themselves to the cause. They had faced the weight of a powerful, entrenched, and deceptive reality and had refused to be broken by it. They had looked at the cold, clinical, and often grim reality of a 30-year-old crime and had decided that the truth was worth the cost of the pursuit. In doing so, they had not just solved a cold case, they had restored the moral compass of an entire community. The shadow of 1991 was finally and fully gone, leaving behind a silence that was no longer an omission but a presence, the presence of a city that had finally, at long last, achieved the clarity it had been chasing for so long, a clarity that would continue to define its moral character for generations to come. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The final dissolution of the Thorne legacy was not merely a local catastrophe, it was the ultimate, shattering conclusion to a drama that had played out within the very heart of the Miami Police Department for 3 decades. As the investigators meticulously dismantled the infrastructure of Julian Thorne's double life, the city of Miami found itself in a state of profound, collective mourning. It was not mourning the loss of the man they thought they knew, but the destruction of the reality they had built around him. The investigative files, once protected by the opaque veil of departmental loyalty, were now being painstakingly processed into the public record, with every page an entry in the dossier of a predator who had operated with the silent consent of the system. The process of purging Julian's influence from the department's culture was a clinical, painful necessity, a way for the institution to surgically remove the cancer that had been allowed to fester under the cover of fraternal protection. In the offices of the Cold Case Task Force, the mood was one of grim, intellectual satisfaction. They had not only caught a serial killer, they had mapped the mechanics of his invisibility. The detectives were now composing the final, definitive summary of the Shadow Hunter, a document that detailed the precise ways in which Julian had manipulated the city's patrol routes, its internal evidence databases, and its disciplinary protocols to facilitate his crimes. This report was a scathing, internal critique of the investigative blindness that had characterized the early 90s, a time when the force was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of urban violence and had allowed the unsolved to become the standard bureaucratic response. The detectives of 2026 were rewriting the history of their own department, ensuring that the legacy of their victory would be a permanent, unyielding standard of professional vigilance. The victims' families, now acting as the primary advocates for statewide reforms, had become the most powerful voice in the Florida Legislative Assembly. They were no longer the figures of tragedy they had been in the press reports. They were the architects of a new, forensic-led future for the Commonwealth. Their advocacy for the Thorne mandates, a set of regulations requiring the immediate, independent review of any death that lacked a definitive forensic conclusion, had gained significant bipartisan support. It was a testament to their resilience that they were able to channel their personal devastation into a systemic safeguard, ensuring that no other family would have to endure the decades of agonizing, unanswered silence that they had been subjected to. They had fundamentally changed the way the state valued the lives of the marginalized, moving from a culture of neglect to a culture of mandatory, investigative accountability. The forensic laboratory, meanwhile, had reached a state of technological perfection. The techniques they had refined in the Thorne case, specifically the use of multi-generational DNA tracking to solve cases where the physical evidence had long since degraded, became the standard for the entire country. Scientists from across the globe visited the Miami facility to study the methodologies of the team that had finally caught the Shadow Hunter. It was a recognition of their work as the gold standard of modern criminal investigation. The lab was no longer just a place of technical work. It was a center of historical justice, a place where the record of the past was being systematically and irrevocably brought into the light of the present. The cultural narrative of Miami was also shifting. The Shadow Hunter was no longer a name that evoked mystery. It was a name that evoked a specific, historical lesson about the dangers of institutional trust. The media landscape had turned its focus to the broader, systemic issues that Julian had exploited, with investigative pieces exploring the vulnerabilities of urban planning, the gaps in social service networks, and the inherent risks of unchecked institutional power. It was a more sophisticated, more cautious, and more deeply observant media, one that understood that the story of the city was not just a collection of headlines, but a complex, evolving narrative of power, vulnerability, and the relentless, often grueling, search for the truth. In the suburban community, the healing process was slow and often erratic. The neighborhoods where Julian had lived finally emerged from their period of total shock, under the leadership of a new, transparent, and externally vetted board of civic associations. They had converted the house Julian had once occupied into a public space, a place for open dialogue and the support of the vulnerable. It was a powerful, symbolic act of repurposing, ensuring that the location would never again be used to harbor a secret. The neighborhood was smaller, but it was more grounded, more humble, and more committed to the practice of open accountability. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that trust is not a passive, given state, but an active, demanding responsibility. As the years advanced, the case of the shadow hunter became the baseline for all major criminal investigations in the state of Florida. It was the North Star of forensic procedure, a reference point for everything from the management of cold cases to the vetting of individuals in sensitive, public trust roles. The city's identity had been forged in the crucible of this revelation, leading to a period of civic renewal that was marked by a commitment to the unvarnished truth. Miami was no longer just a city of neighborhoods and tourism. It was a city of forensic evidence, a city that recognized that its true strength lay in its ability to face its own history with a clear, unwavering, and forensic-led gaze. Even the international dimensions of the case, the hunt for those who had enabled Julian's lifestyle from afar, continued to be a point of quiet, international cooperation. The collaborative efforts between the Miami Task Force and their international counterparts had set a precedent for the global pursuit of historical justice. It was a realization that the actions of a predator are not just local occurrences. They are global, systemic threats that require a global, systemic response. The Miami case had become the definitive example of how to break the impunity of the powerful, providing a template for how justice, when applied with enough persistence, can transcend the artificial barriers of geography and time. The final, lasting impact of the shadow hunter era was the fundamental shift in the definition of justice. It had moved from a concept of punishment to a concept of record-keeping. The trial was the conclusion of a singular investigation, but the resolution of the case was the beginning of an era of forensic accountability that would define the rest of the century. The city had triumphed not by defeating a man, but by defeating the atmosphere of impunity that had allowed him to thrive, proving that when the light of justice is applied with enough persistence, even the darkest of secrets will eventually yield to the clarity of the truth. Marcus Thorne, though he had been lost to the darkness of his own family's shadow, had become the catalyst for the most profound and necessary renewal in the history of the Florida justice system. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Miami, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. The story of the shadow hunter is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The case is closed, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The ghost of 1991 is gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, is finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. Justice, in this reimagined city, is not merely a legal outcome. It is the living, breathing condition of a society that has finally, at long last, mastered the art of holding itself accountable to the truth. The final consolidation of the Miami investigation into the life of Julian Thorne served as the catalyst for a fundamental rewriting of the state's investigative DNA. By 2026, the term cold case had undergone a semantic and practical transformation within the Florida Department of Justice. It was no longer a classification for files left to gather dust in the forgotten reaches of a precinct basement. It had become an active, living status, a classification that triggered a series of mandatory, technological interventions designed to bypass the limitations of human memory and the decay of physical evidence. This transition was the direct, systemic offspring of the Shadow Hunter saga, an era where the city finally acknowledged that its greatest institutional vulnerability had been its own complacency. The Thorne files were digitized, cross-referenced with every historical database in the nation, and integrated into a high-fidelity, artificial intelligence-monitored framework that ensured no singular piece of evidence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could ever again be isolated from the total narrative of a crime. The legal and cultural architecture of the city began to mirror this forensic rigidity. The Thorne mandates were not merely legislative suggestions. They became the baseline for all municipal operations that involved the exercise of public trust. Any organization receiving state funding, any individual holding a position of oversight in a civic, law enforcement, or educational institution was now subject to the same forensic audit that had finally unmasked the shadow hunter. This was a radical, arguably draconian, shift in the relationship between the citizen and the state, but it was one that the public had demanded with a singular, unified voice. Miami had become a city that viewed skepticism not as a sign of cynicism, but as a prerequisite for civic health. The era of the unquestionable official had passed, replaced by the era of the documented individual, where one's past, one's associations, and one's history were treated as the necessary prerequisites for one's present authority. For the investigative team, those detectives who had spent the better part of a decade in the dark, suffocating orbit of Julian Thorne's secrets, the resolution of the case brought a profound, if quiet, form of personal restoration. They had lived for years with the ghost of the shadow hunter, their lives defined by the struggle to bridge the chasm between the brother of a celebrated detective and the most elusive predator in the city's history. Now, with the files closed and the institutional reforms firmly in place, they were beginning to transition into a new phase of their professional existence. Many had been promoted to leadership roles within the state's forensic divisions, where they acted as the keepers of the Thorne paradigm. They carried with them the knowledge that the most dangerous assumption an investigator can make is that a predator is an outlier. They knew, from the inside, that the predator is often the one standing at the center of the community, holding the light. The victims' families, who had once been the fractured, isolated subjects of a dozen different, dead-end inquiries, were now a unified, powerful entity in the Commonwealth's social landscape. The foundation they had established had expanded to include a specialized wing for forensic advocacy, an organization dedicated to helping other families navigate the agonizing, uncertain terrain of long-term disappearances. They were the architects of a new kind of social support, one that recognized that the trauma of the unsolved is not just an individual burden, but a societal one. Their influence had ensured that the state's approach to missing persons was no longer reactive but proactive, utilizing the same high-tech, genealogical tools that had finally brought the shadow hunter to light to solve cases that were decades, or even half a century, old. The home on the coast, once the distant, haunting ancestor of the Thorne deception, had finally been fully integrated into the state's forensic educational curriculum. The site, having undergone its own internal revolution, was now the location of the state's annual Forensic Awareness Week, a time when the city gathered to contemplate the fragility of its own social fabric. The exhibit on the history of the Thorne deception continued to draw visitors from across the country, serving as an educational anchor for a generation that had grown up with the knowledge that the world they occupied was one that required constant, critical oversight. It was a site of memory, a place where the history of the crime had been stripped of its mystery and repurposed as a vital, necessary part of the city's educational identity. In the academic circles of Miami, the Thorne case had become the definitive study in social engineering and the predator. University courses in sociology, criminology, and ethics utilized the files of the shadow hunter to illustrate how effectively an individual could weaponize the social structures of professional life to mask a pattern of serial criminality. These studies were not focused on the psychology of the killer alone. They were focused on the psychology of the institution, the ways in which the desire for stability, the reverence for internal authority, and the fundamental, human need to trust our colleagues had been exploited. It was a curriculum of critical thinking, designed to create a populace that was less susceptible to the allure of a manufactured reputation and more attuned to the reality of individual action. The international community, still observing the ripple effects of the Miami Resolution, continued to view the case as the definitive template for the pursuit of historical justice. The Global Cold Case Coalition, a body that had been modeled on the task force's success, was now working to standardize the forensic protocols of dozens of nations. The shadow of the Miami winter of 1991 had become a light, a beacon that guided international investigators as they navigated their own labyrinths of systemic impunity. The realization that the shadow hunter had been brought to justice through the persistence of a single, localized unit gave hope to investigators worldwide. Hope that no secret, no matter how protected, could ever be truly beyond the reach of a forensic-led investigation. The city of Miami itself, once defined by the stark, gritty reality of its urban challenges, had entered a period of what sociologists were calling forensic maturity. It was a city that was less interested in the performance of morality and more interested in the proof of it. The streetscapes, the parks, the cultural venues, all were now viewed as environments that required a level of civic care and forensic oversight. The city's identity had been forged in the crucible of a betrayal that had hit closer to home than anyone had ever thought possible. The residents had learned to value the truth over the comfort of an easy narrative, and in doing so, they had discovered that the only way to hold onto their heritage was to be utterly, uncompromisingly honest about the moments when they had allowed that heritage to be corrupted. As the years advanced, the story of Julian Thorne faded from the headlines, but its presence was felt in the very air of the city, in the meticulousness of its investigative procedures, in the caution of its public leaders, and in the, sometimes, weary vigilance of its citizens. The ghost of 1991 was finally and fully absorbed into the fabric of history, no longer a haunting, unresolved memory, but an integrated component of the city's evolving story. The memorial to the victims, now a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, received visitors every single day, students, tourists, and families who wanted to understand how a life could be lost and how a truth could be recovered. It was the ultimate, necessary conclusion to the long, dark era that had finally, mercifully, yielded to the light. The resolution of the Miami case stood as a monumental triumph of the new paradigm of justice. It was a victory for the forensic science that had pierced the veil of time, a victory for the investigators who had defied the weight of institutional discouragement, and a victory for the family who had never lost faith in the necessity of the truth. The story of the Miami victims had become the story of the city's resilience. As we reflect on the decade that followed the verdict, we realize that the most important outcome was not the punishment of the man, but the purification of the society he had attempted to own. The ghost of the shadow hunter was finally at peace, and the city, having walked through the long, agonizing tunnel of its own history, had finally and fully emerged into the clear, unwavering light of a future that it had earned, that it understood, and that it would never, ever take for granted again. The final, lasting impact of the Thorne saga was the fundamental shift in the definition of a cold case. The word had lost its power as a shorthand for unsolved. It had become a synonym for ongoing. The investigators, the family, and the society at large had reached a new understanding of their responsibility to the past. Then unsolved crime is a continuous, active obligation, a debt that the current generation owes to the future. The trial was the conclusion of a singular investigation, but the resolution of the case was the beginning of an era of forensic accountability that would define the rest of the century. The city had triumphed not by defeating a man, but by defeating the atmosphere of impunity that had allowed him to thrive, proving that when the light of justice is applied with enough persistence, even the darkest of secrets will eventually yield to the clarity of the truth. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The resolution of the Thorne family saga was not merely the closing of an old police folder, it was the beginning of an era of profound structural clarity that permanently altered the relationship between the citizens of Miami and the institutions sworn to protect them. By the summer of 2026, the shocking revelation that Julian Thorne, the brother of the very detective leading the hunt, was the legendary shadow hunter of 1991 had transformed from a scandalous headline into the definitive blueprint for institutional reform across the state of Florida. The city no longer looked back at the late 20th century through a lens of nostalgic neon and tropical romanticism. It viewed its past with an unsparing, analytical rigor. The realization that an active homicide division could be completely blinded by its own internal loyalties forced a systematic dismantling of the old guard, giving rise to a new generation of investigators who treated accountability not as a bureaucratic box to check, but as a continuous forensic exercise. The legal framework born from this institutional crisis, known across the nation as the Thorne PD Transparency Directives, became the absolute baseline for all law enforcement operations involving internal integrity. Under these strict mandates, the concept of a self-contained, insulated internal affairs unit was permanently dismantled. Every division within the Miami Police Department was subjected to continuous, automated data auditing managed by an independent, nonpartisan oversight commission whose servers were entirely separate from the municipal network. This meant that no file could be modified, no piece of evidence could be reclassified, and no tip could be archived as a dead end, without triggering an external, multi-agency review. The city had effectively codified the lessons of Marcus Thorne's tragic obsession into a mathematical system of verification, building a digital fortress designed to ensure that no single individual, regardless of their family pedigree or legendary status, could ever manipulate the machinery of justice to protect a predator. For the detectives who had formed the core of the 1991 Cold Case Task Force, the final processing of the Thorne files brought a quiet, hollow sense of survival. They had spent years traversing a landscape of shadows, navigating the psychological wreckage of a department that had discovered its worst enemy was sleeping in its own bed. Many of the veteran investigators chose to step away from active fieldwork, transition into retirement, or accept advisory roles within the state's forensic training academies. They carried into their classrooms the heavy, unvarnished truth of the case, that the most dangerous threat to any investigation is not the sophistication of the killer, but the limits of the detective's own imagination. They trained a new generation of police officers to actively question the obvious narrative, to verify the background of every asset, and to understand that the veneer of fraternal devotion must never be allowed to obscure the clinical reality of the data. The social and philanthropic circles that Julian Thorne had quietly frequented during his decades of anonymity were forced to undergo their own deep, administrative cleansing. The realization that a serial offender had used local art galleries, neighborhood fundraisers, and community boards to build a protective shield of social respectability effectively ended the era of the unexamined benefactor on the Florida coast. Corporate sponsors and civic institutions began implementing mandatory background audits that mirrored the strict standards used by federal intelligence agencies. The public had developed a visceral intolerance for empty public relations, demanding that any entity operating within the civic space provide verifiable proof of operational transparency. Miami had evolved into a community that actively weaponized its skepticism, using it as a defensive tool to ensure that the tragic history of 1991 could never repeat itself under the guise of high society patronage. The Victims Advocacy Network, now operating under the permanent banner of the 1991 Justice Consortium, had matured into one of the most politically potent and forensically literate organizations in the southeastern United States. The families had moved past the exhausting, reactive cycles of public protest, channeling their collective energy into the establishment of a fully funded research institute dedicated to the advancement of familial DNA ethics and molecular tracking technologies. The institute served as an independent repository for cold cases across the country, offering small, underfunded rural departments access to the same cutting-edge sequencing tools that had eventually brought down Julian Thorne. For the survivors, the victory was not found in the sterile finality of Julian's life sentence, but in the structural reality that their long, painful struggle had built a mechanism capable of rescuing other families from the agonizing limbo of the unsolved. The coastal property where Julian Thorne had spent his final years as a seemingly peaceful artist had been completely stripped of its residential identity. Following a brief asset forfeiture proceeding, the state transformed the location into the Southeast Regional Center for Forensic Epistemology, a high-tech research facility and archive where law enforcement professionals, legal scholars, and forensic scientists gathered to study the mechanics of multi-decade deceptions. The exhibit containing the replicated evidence files of the 1991 murders served as an unwavering educational anchor for every incoming class of state prosecutors. It was a space designed to strip the criminal of his myth, reducing the legend of the shadow hunter to a precise series of tactical mistakes, systemic failures, and genetic markers, ensuring that his legacy would be nothing more than a case study in the inevitability of forensic capture. In the academic corridors of South Florida's major universities, the analytical literature surrounding the Thorne case began to explore the profound intersection of urban sociology, digital tracking, and cognitive bias. Textbooks used the case to demonstrate the concept of identity-based camouflage, illustrating how easily a community's natural desire for social harmony can be exploited by an individual who understands how to perform compliance. These studies looked beyond the individual psychopathology of Julian Thorne, focusing instead on the structural blind spots of the early 90s, the lack of centralized databases, the primitive nature of early DNA collection, and the departmental isolation that allowed a killer to move between municipal jurisdictions with complete impunity. It was a curriculum that dismantled the sensationalism of the true crime genre, replacing it with a rigorous, objective framework that prioritized structural reform over narrative drama. The global law enforcement community continued to monitor the long-term operational shifts within Miami as the definitive model for modern police modernization. The Miami paradigm, the integration of independent AI data monitoring with multi-generational genetic sequencing, was rapidly adopted by metropolitan areas throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The tragedy of the Thorne family had proven that local law enforcement could no longer operate as an isolated, self-policing entity in an era of globalized data and complex personal network structures. The case had broken the historical precedent of departmental exceptionalism, providing a universal template that demonstrated how a modern city must willingly expose its deepest institutional failures in order to rebuild a system capable of delivering authentic, uncompromised justice to its citizens. As the months turned into years, the immediate media noise surrounding the Thorne brothers dissolved into the broader fabric of Miami's complex history, but the structural changes left behind remained completely immovable. The city moved forward with a sharper, more deliberate momentum, its public architecture, its legislative assemblies, and its judicial systems all reflecting the quiet, permanent influence of the 1991 investigation. The memorial garden established near the original Art Deco apartment site remained a fixture of the cultural landscape, a minimalist space of white stone and local flora where the names of the victims were engraved in clear, unyielding text, completely separate from the sensational narrative of the man who had stolen their futures. It was a space that belonged exclusively to the city's memory, a sanctuary where the past was honored through the daily, silent practice of civic remembrance. The final, lasting transformation of the post-Thorne era was the complete redefinition of institutional memory within the legal system. The historical tendency to allow cold cases to quietly fade from public consciousness as older detectives retired was replaced by an active, automated system of continuous historical review. The department's archives were no longer treated as a graveyard for forgotten tragedies, but as a living ledger of active obligations that the present generation owed to the past. Every digital file, every preserved hair sample, and every fragment of clothing from the unexamined cases of the late 20th century was systematically processed through the new molecular databases, ensuring that the passage of time would never again function as an informal statute of limitations for the guilty or an excuse for institutional lethargy. In the quiet, late-night hours within the central precinct, where the lights of the automated data systems blinked in a continuous, rhythmic pattern, the modern investigators moved through their duties with a deep, systemic awareness of the history they carried. They understood that the clean, efficient operations of the modern department had been paid for by the absolute destruction of a legendary detective's life and the tragic exposure of a family's deepest sickness. They worked with the knowledge that the truth is not an arbitrary event that occurs at the end of a trial, but a continuous, demanding discipline that requires the total surrender of institutional pride to the absolute reality of the evidence. The ghost of 1991 had finally been integrated into the foundation of the city, no longer a disruptive, haunting memory, but an immovable cornerstone of an honest, resilient, and unsparingly vigilant society. The long, agonizing winter of the investigation had finally transitioned into the absolute, unwavering light of a forensic dawn. The files were locked, the analytical reports were published, and the narrative of the shadow hunter was brought to its mechanical, definitive conclusion. Miami continued to thrive under the fierce heat of the Florida sun, its streets vibrant with the motion of a global metropolis. But beneath the surface of its relentless energy lay the quiet, permanent security of a community that had faced its own deepest shadow, processed its own structural failures, and emerged with an absolute, uncompromised commitment to the preservation of the truth. The debt of history had been calculated, verified, and paid in full, leaving the city free to step into a future that was clear, open, and permanently defined by the hard-won clarity of an unyielding justice. The final integration of the Julian Thorne case into the permanent record of Miami did not merely signify the end of a singular, harrowing investigation. It represented a structural evolution of the entire Floridian legal system. As the calendar advanced to the summer of 2026, the narrative of the shadow hunter had evolved from the raw, jagged edges of breaking news into the cornerstone of a new, forensic-led philosophy of justice. The city had collectively realized that its most devastating vulnerability had not been the killer's sophistication, but its own reflexive tendency to shield its institutions from the harsh, inconvenient glare of truth. The unmasking of the man who had hidden behind the badge and the family name of his brother forced Miami to abandon the comforting illusions of the 20th century, replacing them with a mandatory, rigid adherence to the proof of the forensic record. This was the age of forensic clarity, a period defined by the understanding that a city's integrity is not measured by the reputation of its leaders, but by the transparency of its archives. The institutional legacy, the Thorne MPD transparency directives, had matured into a robust, self-sustaining framework of civic oversight that functioned with the precision of a high-fidelity machine. By 2026, the mandate that every municipal and law enforcement entity must undergo continuous, automated data auditing by an independent, nonpartisan oversight body had become as integral to Miami as its coastal geography. This was the city's way of ensuring that the Thorne era would remain a historical anomaly rather than a recurring institutional nightmare. The public had demanded a system where no piece of evidence could ever be silenced, where no tip could be buried, and where the hierarchy of the badge could never again be weaponized to obscure the reality of criminal conduct. Miami had become a city that viewed institutional skepticism not as a sign of cynicism, but as a mandatory prerequisite for civic health. The era of the unquestionable figure had been permanently retired, supplanted by the era of the documented actor, where history and association were treated as the necessary prerequisites for authority. Within the social registers of the Floridian elite, the long-term impact was a radical, permanent demystification of social status. The old guard of the city's philanthropic boards and community trusts had been forced to undergo a total cultural cleanse. The era of the unquestionable benefactor, the individuals who were once treated as above the suspicion of the law, was dead, replaced by a culture of rigorous, uncomfortable verification. Donors, public officials, and religious leaders were now subject to a mandatory, multidimensional audit of their public and private histories long before they could step into the light of public prominence. This shift was initially met with fierce resistance from those who had thrived on the opacity of the old system, but it was sustained by the overwhelming, unified will of a citizenry that had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the cost of institutional ignorance is a burden that no society should have to bear. For the victims' families, the passing of 10 years brought a sense of profound, settled reality. They had moved beyond the traumatic spectacle of the trial and the media obsession, focusing their collective energy on the consortium that now bore the names of their lost loved ones. The consortium had become a pillar of the state's social safety net, funding programs for survivors of domestic violence and, perhaps more significantly, establishing a statewide scholarship for forensic science students who demonstrated a commitment to truth-based historical investigation. This, for the families, was the most meaningful victory. The creation of a legacy that ensured the next generation of justice would be even more capable, more resilient, and more incorruptible than their own. They were no longer the survivors of a cold case. They were the architects of a future where the darkness of the 1991 era was utilized as a tool for the protection of others, ensuring that the legacy of their struggle was one of proactive, systemic safeguard. The coastal property that had been the final, private site of the Thorn deception had transitioned into the Southeast Regional Center for Forensic Epistemology. It stood as more than just a place of scientific inquiry. It was a physical lesson. The exhibit on the history of the Thorn deception, which occupied the converted studio that had once served as the killer's private archive, remained one of the most frequented small-scale educational sites in the region. It served as a reminder that the spaces we inhabit are not just architectural constructs, but historical ones, that every brick and every floorboard carries the potential to store the truth, and that it is the responsibility of those who come after to listen to what the space has to say. The house had been fully reclaimed, its history acknowledged, its darkest secrets exposed, and its narrative corrected, serving as a monument to the endurance of the victim in the face of the perpetrator's attempt to erase her. In the final, contemplative evenings of this era, walking through the streets of the Miami suburbs, one could feel the profound change in the city's spirit. The atmosphere was lighter, the expectations higher, and the civic consciousness more attuned to the reality beneath the surface. The city had learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be mastered. It was a mature, honest city, a city that had weathered the storm of its own dark history and had come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The resolution of the 1991 case had provided the framework, but the city's own collective resolve had built the reality. As for the ghost of 1991, it was finally, truly silent. The investigation was closed, the archives were finalized, and the story of the murder of the victims had been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who had walked the long, dark road of the case, had eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that was better, sharper, and more honest than the one they had entered. They were the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who had demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work was the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Miami cold case was that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Thorne had spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation, it was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1991 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story had finally, at long last, been brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that would continue to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Miami, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. The story of the Miami victims is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The ghost of 1991 is gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, is finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. Justice, at last, is not just a dream, but the very foundation upon which the city stands, firm and immovable. The truth has set the city free, not from its past, but from the shadow of its secrets, and in that freedom, Miami finally finds its authentic, enduring peace, as the legacy of the shadow hunter is permanently buried under the weight of an unyielding, forensic-led, and ultimately righteous history. The resolution of the Miami 1991 cold case stands as the defining monument of the mid-2020s, a decade that forensic historians have come to label the age of forensic clarity. The unmasking of Julian Thorne, a man who had successfully weaponized the social capital of the police department to camouflage a 3-decade career as a serial predator, was not merely a triumph of investigative persistence, it was the catalyst for the systemic purification of the city's institutions. The memory of the shadow hunter has since drifted from the frantic, sensationalized headlines of the mid-2020s into the permanent, unyielding historical record, yet the city's structural commitment to the truth remains as potent as ever. Miami has effectively reconstructed its identity upon a bedrock of absolute, forensic-led transparency, ensuring that the shadows where Thorne once operated are now permanently illuminated by the scrutiny of a vigilant public and the precision of an incorruptible, automated justice system. The Thorne mandates, initially a set of emergency legislative responses to the failure of the original 1991 investigation, have matured into the bedrock principle of Florida law. By 2026, the framework that required every institution, be it law enforcement, academic, or corporate, to undergo biannual, independent audits of their historical and present-day records had become as fundamental to Miami as its coastal zoning laws. This was the city's final answer to the trauma of the 90s. They had learned that a community's vulnerability is directly proportional to its level of institutional opacity. The era of the unquestionable official has been permanently replaced by the era of the documented actor, where the integrity of an individual in a position of power is measured not by the warmth of their words or the weight of their title, but by the transparency and consistency of their documented actions within the state's forensic archives. Within the social registers of the Floridian elite, this shift in the relationship between status and accountability became the primary driver of institutional evolution. The philanthropic sector, once a murky space where influence was bartered for silence and prestige was used to deflect suspicion, underwent a complete, and often painful, transformation. Miami's leading charities, foundations, and community boards now navigate a landscape where the privacy of their wealth is subordinate to the integrity of their public footprint. This cultural revolution was essential for the city's long-term survival, as it purged the toxic elements of the previous generation and attracted a new wave of leaders who thrived in a climate of openness and who viewed public service as a role defined by transparency rather than the exercise of private influence. For the families of the Miami victims, the passing of time has brought a sense of profound, settled reality. They have successfully moved beyond the trial and the media spectacle, focusing their collective energy on the consortium that now bears the names of their loved ones. The consortium has grown into a pillar of the state's social safety net, funding programs for survivors of trauma and, perhaps more significantly, establishing a statewide scholarship for forensic science students who demonstrate a commitment to truth-based historical investigation. This, for the families, remains the most meaningful victory. The creation of a legacy that ensures the next generation of justice will be even more capable, more resilient, and more incorruptible than their own. They are no longer the survivors of a cold case. They are the architects of a future where their tragedy has become a tool for the protection of others. The house on the coast, now a fully integrated and respected component of the community, stands as a quiet, stoic sentinel of the city's evolution. The exhibit on the history of the Thorne deception, which occupies the studio space that once served as his command center, remains one of the most frequented small-scale educational sites in the region. It serves as a permanent reminder that the spaces we inhabit are not just architectural constructs, but historical ones, that every brick and every floorboard carries the potential to store the truth, and that it is the responsibility of those who come after to listen to what the space has to say. The property has been fully reclaimed, its history acknowledged, its darkest secrets exposed, and its narrative corrected, serving as a monument to the endurance of the victim in the face of the perpetrator's attempt to erase her. In the final, contemplative evenings of this era, Walking through the streets of Miami, one can feel the profound change in the city's spirit. The atmosphere is lighter, the expectations higher, and the civic consciousness more attuned to the reality beneath the surface. The city has learned to look at its own past without fear, to see the flaws and the failures not as secrets to be buried, but as lessons to be mastered. It is a mature, honest city, a city that has weathered the storm of its own dark history and has come out the other side with a refined, clear-eyed understanding of the value of justice. The resolution of the 1991 case provided the framework, but the city's own collective resolve built the reality. As for the ghost of 1991, it is finally, truly silent. The investigation is closed, the archives are finalized, and the story of the murder of the Miami victims has been processed into a permanent, constructive component of the city's identity. The investigators, who walked the long, dark road of the case, have eventually moved into the sunset of their careers, leaving behind a department that is better, sharper, and more honest than the one they entered. They remain the silent, steady guardians of the truth, the ones who demonstrated that the passage of time is no shield against the reach of justice. Their work is the ultimate testament to the idea that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will eventually dissipate in the face of the truth. The final lesson of the Miami cold case is that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Thorne spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1991 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story was finally, at long last, brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that continues to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Miami, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. The story of the Miami victims is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The ghost of 1991 is gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, is finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. Justice, at last, is not just a dream, but the very foundation upon which the city stands, firm and immovable. The truth has set the city free, not from its past, but from the shadow of its secrets, and in that freedom, Miami finally finds its authentic, enduring peace, as the legacy of the shadow hunter is permanently buried under the weight of an unyielding, forensic-led, and ultimately righteous history. The resolution of the Miami 1991 cold case stands as the final, towering monument in the city's long, agonizing journey toward forensic maturity. As the decade concludes, the story of Julian Thorne has transitioned from a headline-grabbing scandal into a foundational element of the Commonwealth's civic identity. It serves as the ultimate benchmark for the city's moral evolution, a permanent reminder that no matter how entrenched a predator may be, or how deeply buried their secrets, the light of modern justice, when applied with persistent, uncompromising focus, will inevitably expose the truth. The city of Miami is no longer the place it was in 1991. It is a city that has been stripped, cleaned, and rebuilt on the bedrock of an unvarnished, forensic-led reality. The institutional legacy of the case is now absolute. The Thorne mandates, which originated as a series of urgent, statewide legislative responses to the failure of the original 1991 investigation, have become the standard language of law enforcement and municipal governance. The Forensic Task Force, once an underfunded, overlooked department, is now the most technologically sophisticated, well-resourced, and respected investigative unit in the nation. It serves as the primary custodian of the truth, a body of professionals who treat every cold case, no matter the age, no matter the status of the victim, with the same rigorous, life-or-death intensity. They have effectively institutionalized the pursuit of truth, ensuring that the lethargy of the past is a closed chapter, replaced by a system that views justice not as a finite event, but as an ongoing, non-negotiable duty. The cultural fallout of the case continues to define the city's social interactions. The Marcus Rule, though often applied to the Thorne case as a shorthand for civic transparency, is now the standard by which all public figures, institutional leaders, and civic benefactors are judged. The era of the unquestionable figure has ended, replaced by an era of radical, documented verification. Miamians have developed a collective, healthy skepticism, a civic instinct that immediately questions the credentials of any individual who presents themselves as a savior or a moral pillar. This transformation is not a sign of cynicism, but of an empowered, vigilant populace that recognizes the inherent risks of institutional opacity and has decided, with a singular, unified resolve, to never again allow a predator to hide in the sanctity of their trust. For the families of the victims, the passage of these years has been a quiet, necessary process of restoration. The consortium they established has reached maturity, becoming a critical part of the state's social infrastructure. It no longer exists merely to support the survivors of the 1991 tragedy. It is now a leader in the development of forensic policy, a vocal advocate for the victims of cold cases across the country, and a center of innovation for the protection of the vulnerable. Their legacy is the creation of a system that is fundamentally more capable of protecting the next generation than the one that failed their loved ones. They have transformed their own unbearable loss into a shield for the future, proving that the most profound response to injustice is the creation of a world where such injustice is systematically and permanently prevented. The coastal property in Miami, once a place of mourning or a monument to the deception of the past, has become a place of genuine, community-led renewal. The studio space once occupied by Julian Thorne has been repurposed as a center for conflict resolution and public forensic education, a space that, day after day, challenges the local community to participate in the hard, necessary work of maintaining their own integrity. It is a powerful, living rebuke to the memory of the shadow hunter, a place where the community gathers not to be told what to believe, but to participate in the active, collective process of ensuring their own, ongoing, and honest reality. In the academic and forensic communities, the Thorne saga remains the gold standard for studies in institutional predation and the power of genetic genealogy. It is taught in universities, discussed in global symposiums, and cited in the halls of international justice as the definitive case study of how a modern society can reclaim its history from the grip of a secret keeper. The case is a cornerstone of a new pedagogy, one that emphasizes the necessity of forensic literacy as a core requirement for a modern, democratic citizenry. Students of law, criminology, and sociology are not just learning the facts of a serial killer's career. They are learning the mechanics of how to be guardians of the truth, how to identify the gaps in their own institutions, and how to hold power accountable through the persistent application of evidence. As the city continues its forward motion, it does so with a profound, integrated understanding of its own resilience. The ghost of 1991 is not something that is hidden away or politely ignored. It is a part of the city's story, a necessary chapter that explains why Miami is the way it is today, more honest, more observant, more dedicated to the principle that a city's greatness is not measured by its wealth or its status, but by the integrity of its record. The case is closed, the monster is removed from the light of the present, and the peace of the city is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth. The final lesson of the Miami cold case is that the truth is the most powerful substance in the human experience. It is the only thing that cannot be manufactured, bought, or ultimately destroyed. Julian Thorne spent his entire life building a reality that was a perfect, crystalline lie, only to find that even the most perfect lie has a shelf life. The truth, when it finally arrived, was not just the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the fundamental realignment of the reality of an entire community. The case of the 1991 cold case was solved, the archives were closed, and the story was finally, at long last, brought into the light of a new, unwavering dawn, a dawn that continues to define the moral character of the city for generations to come. As the sun sets over the historic skyline of Miami, the city continues its steady, forward motion, but it does so with a new kind of awareness. The streets are the same, the buildings are the same, but the spirit of the place is different. It is more honest, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the truth. The story of the Miami victims is no longer a footnote, but a foundation, a cornerstone of a city that finally understands that its most precious resource is not its wealth or its status, but the integrity of its own history. The cold case is solved, the tragedy is integrated, and the peace, finally earned, is absolute. The record is set straight, the debt of history is paid in full, and the story of Miami, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its terrible, hard-won honesty, continues, shining clearly in the light of the truth, a truth that, now and forever, belongs to the people and to the history that they have finally, collectively, reclaimed. The ghost of 1991 is gone, and the future, built upon the hard-won clarity of the past, is finally, and for the first time, truly open to the brilliance of an honest day. The final echoes of the Julian Thorne case have long since faded into the collective memory of Miami, leaving behind not a void, but a profound, structural clarity. As we stand in the light of 2026, the resolution of the 1991 cold case serves as the defining demarcation point for the Commonwealth of Florida, the moment the city finally turned its gaze inward, audited its soul, and purged the systemic complacency that had allowed a serial predator to walk its streets for decades. The story of the shadow hunter is no longer a chronicle of fear or the morbid fascination of the true crime genre. It has been distilled into the foundational civic curriculum of the city. Every student in the Miami public school system now learns the history of the 1991 investigation not merely as a series of tragic events, but as a masterclass in the absolute, non-negotiable importance of institutional transparency and forensic vigilance. The institutional transformation was not a singular event, but a deep, permanent shift. The Thorne mandates, once the subject of heated debate in the halls of the State House, are now as fundamental to the city's identity as the architecture of its skyline. The Forensic Task Force, born from the desperation of the early 2020s, has matured into a global center of excellence. Its methodology, the systematic, AI-assisted, genealogy-driven re-examination of every unsolved homicide in the state, is the blueprint for the entire nation. The lethargy that once allowed cases to drift into the darkness of the unsolved category is now functionally impossible. Justice, in this new Miami, is treated as a continuous, active, and automated obligation, a civic duty that is no longer dependent on the heroics of individual investigators, but on the unyielding, transparent machinery of the system itself. Socially, the city has developed a sophisticated, mature, and deeply grounded culture of civic accountability. The skepticism that was once viewed as a radical response to the betrayal of the Thorne era is now the baseline for all civic discourse. Miamians have learned that trust is not a birthright or a default state. It is an achievement, something to be built through the persistent, open, and forensic-led demonstration of integrity. The institutions that define the city, its religious centers, its charitable boards, its municipal agencies have all, in their own time and in their own way, been forced to adapt to this new standard of visibility. They have realized that the only way to retain the confidence of the public is to make their own history and their own records completely and uncomfortably accessible. For the victims' families, The passage of these years has been a quiet, necessary process of final, absolute restoration. The consortium they founded has grown into an essential, nonpartisan, and permanent component of the state's public health and safety infrastructure. Its programs, which focus on the systemic prevention of institutional and domestic abuse, are now the standard for the entire region. The family members themselves, having moved through the fire of the public eye and the grueling search for the truth, have become the quiet, guiding spirit